I wanted to go through the process of how all those pieces of code in the Guitar Shop application are working together. We look first at the Chapter 4 sample application from the textbook and then glimpse at the Chapter 5 application. So let's say I'm here in the web browser and I go to the Chapter 4 application for the Guitar Shop. Note that the URL that's specified doesn't actually specify a particular file that should be retrieved by the server. In that case, the server looks for some default files, usually starting with index.html, and then I might look at index.shtml, index.php, and so on. In our case, if we look at the application, and we see here there's an index.php file, and that is the code that is executed in this case. The server will perform those PHP statements, retrieve some data from the database, and then the browser gets the resulting HTML back, so it will display here this product list table. Okay. And in the product list table there's a form. Let's see, here's a part of the form, and then on the bottom there are two links. So let's go back to the web page. So here's a form. So for each row there's really one form with the delete button, and then here's these two links. Okay. So let's say I click on the link add product. Okay, so obviously it shows now the add product form. So what happens here? Well, let's look at the code. If we click on the link add product, then this anchor tag will tell that we have to, or the server should retrieve that file add product form.php. So in turn the server will execute the code here in add product form.php and displays the add product form. And note that the server really doesn't know any of the PHP variables that had been used before when the index.php file was executed. So in particular here, when we display in the add product form the categories, notice here that box that displays those different categories, the server doesn't know those anymore. So in the add product form.php file we need to make explicitly another database query to get the category information. Okay, so now let's actually add a product. Okay, so I just type in some dummy information. Let's say code D01. Let's say I pick a drum. Okay, and then name my drum and price 100. Okay, so we add that product. Alright, so what happens now if we click the add product button? Okay, so we have to go again, look at the code, and if we look at the add product button here, that's the button, it's included in this form, and in the form tag it's specified what kind of action has to be performed if that submit button here is clicked, and it says that the server should retrieve the add product.php file, and using a so-called post method. So come back to that later. So as soon as I click the add product button, the add product.php file will be executed by the server. So if we go in here, then that's what's going to happen. And in particular here is a statement that inserts a product. But now again, this file is going to be executed from scratch, and the server has no knowledge of the previous variables. So how is that information passed from this form to the add_product.php file. And the only way we have right now to pass that information is by using the post or get array. So here, if you look at the method that's specified in the form tag, there's a method attribute and that's set to post. That means that all the fields in the form, those values are stored in the post array and can be retrieved then by whatever action is here requested. And this post array is an associative array. So each entry in the post array has a key and associated value. So what are the keys and the values? Well, the value is whatever's entered into the field. So if I had before entered here DO1, that is a value. And what is a key for that value? Well, that key is specified by the corresponding input field by the name attribute. So as soon as we submit the form, there will be a key in a post array with name code, and one with name name, and one with name price. Those keys, like code, is associated with whatever the user entered in the field for the code. So in add_product, we can retrieve here, for example, the code and the name and the price, and also the category ID is passed on through that select field. Again, it has a key category ID, and whatever option has been selected will be stored in the post array. Okay, so we can directly access a post array, like we could say something like $_post, and then put in a key, which was here in this case category ID, if I didn't mistype this, and then it would retrieve the content of that field. But we have learned it's much better to use the filter input function. So the filter input function does that for us and does a little bit more. So the first argument says access a post array, access the field with key category ID, and then we can on top of it make sure that the entry really is an integer value. So that's how the data gets retrieved from the previous form. So just through the post array, or in other cases possibly through the get array. Now after we have clicked the add button, then remember we saw the product form again, or the table that lists all the product. And so how does that get displayed? Well, if you look at the add_product code, at the very end there's this include statement, and we include the index.php file. So you can think of the include statement as you really just copy and paste the content of index.php into this place where we have the include statement. So this is just replaced by the content of index.php. So after adding actually the new product into the database, the server will continue executing the index file again. So in this case, it retrieves the information, the product information from the database, and displays the table with the delete button and so on. And note here that if we look back here, let me actually add again another drum. So if I add a drum to my drum 2, and this costs $200. So if I add another drum, then after adding this, we see actually the table for the drum and not the default table for the guitars. So why does the application know that we just entered a drum and it should now display a drum? Well, remember, so in the add_product form, we retrieve the category ID from the added product, which was a drum. So this ID will refer to the drum. Okay. And then if we just paste the code of the index.php file in here, it actually, in this case, it does have access to this variable and value because we include it. So if it executes the index.php file, if you look at the top, then this category will be set, and it will be set to drum, so it doesn't really go inside that body of the if statement. And then in turn here it will display the corresponding category. Okay, so what happens now if we actually delete a product? Obviously, if I delete here drum2, then it disappears from the table and supposedly removed from the database table products. So we are seeing the form from index.php, and we have clicked this submit button, delete. So this form here is relevant here, and this form specifies that if we click the submit button, delete, then the delete product.php code should be executed. And if there's any data that's passed to that code, then this data will be in a post array. In particular, what do we pass on in a post array? Well, all the input fields here, which are actually hidden. The user doesn't see them, but this information nevertheless is passed on to it. And we hide it because, for example, we need the product ID to delete the right product. And remember, the product ID uniquely identifies the product to be deleted, but we don't want to see the product ID actually in that product table. So we pass it in as a hidden field. We also pass in here as a hidden field the category ID when we delete an item. Alright, so let's see what the delete product.php code does. Okay, so it has no knowledge really generally of the variables that have been used before. So we use a post array here to retrieve the product ID and also the category ID. Now if you look at that SQL statement that deletes the product, it doesn't actually need the category ID. We just need the product ID. So why do we actually pass on the category ID for this part? Well, that's because after we delete the product, we want to go back to the product table, and we want to display the same category, like in our case it was drums, that was displayed before. Now, you don't want to delete a drum, and then if you go back to displaying the product table, it shows the guitars. So we include again at the end the index.php file, so you can think of it just pasting the code here in this place. So the code that's executed here in index.php has access to the category ID and actually also to the variable product ID. So here again, the category is set and the corresponding category will be displayed in the table. So in summary, if you click a submit button, then the action that's specified in the attribute action of the form tag, that is the one that's executed. And it's executed from scratch and doesn't have access to the variables that were used, like here in this code. We only can pass in information using the post or possibly the get array. Now if we click on a link, like add product, then the specified file will be executed and the server returns the resulting HTML code to the browser, which then displays it. So here if we go on the link add product, then the add product form.php will be executed. And again, when that code is executed, the server doesn't have any more knowledge about the variables that were used before. Just like the category ID here used, the server doesn't know anything about those variables anymore. So now let's look at the same application basically that applies MVC pattern. So the principles are exactly the same, but now the code is much better structured. And whenever a submit button is clicked or a link is clicked, then we call the controller file, so the index.php file. So if you look at that program manager part, then index.php is a controller file. And if you look at, let's say, product add form, for example, if, let's say, we click the submit button to add a product, then the action that's executed, let's see, you start the form, that action is index.php. So the controller does actually add the product and makes sure the page that's displayed next is the proper form. And again, the information about the product to be added is passed in this case, through the post array to the controller. Now, if the controller executes, how do we know that we actually just added a product and maybe we didn't perform some other kind of operation? And that's where this action variable is used for. So remember that if, let's say, we are in the add product form and we submit some entered product, then we say to the server, perform the index.php file, and the server again doesn't have any knowledge of variables that were used before here, but just passes in any data that's added in the fields of the form through the post array. So we want to tell the controller file that the action here that should be taken is to add the product. You get the data from the post array and add the product to the product database. So that's why we add here another hidden field to specify to the controller file what kind of action has to be taken. And this name action really is totally disconnected from this name action. This is just the action attribute of the form that specifies what file to execute next. This one, this name, is a user specified name. I mean, we could have named it differently, but it made sense to name it action. So the post array is going to have a key action, and the value here we just hard coded in there is add product. So in the index file, the first thing we do, nope, I want that. The first thing we do is we retrieve the action that's specified in the post array using the filter input and store it in a variable that also again called action. But again, this key here is not associated, or it's not the same than this variable. We could have called this variable differently. Okay, now it could be in some cases the action isn't specified in the post array, but in the get array. When is that the case here in our application? Let's go again to the product add form. Of course, if I would use the get method, then also data would be stored in the get array. But remember that typically that's not a good idea, because if you use the get method, the values that passed on to, in this case, index.php are visible in the URL. But there is another case where actually the get array is used, and that is if instead of adding a product, we just go back to the product list. So let's look here again at the corresponding application in the web browser. So we're in Guitar Shop 5 and we're in the product manager, and we said okay, we add a product, but then we change our mind and we go back to view product list. So in this case we also return control to the controller, and it's just an anchor tag, and it specifies here the relative link index.php. Again, it's the controller file. But now we can pass on through the URL these parameters. We have just one, the name is action, and the values list product. And that parameter really can be retrieved through the get array. So there will be a key action with value list products in the get array. So if instead of adding actual product we click the view product list, then control is returned also again to index.php, but now the data will be retrieved from the get array. And remember, the key we specified here as action, that refers to exactly this key or parameter name, and we take the value from the get array. Okay, I think that kind of shows how all those different snippets are working together, using form action or anchor tags and passing values through the post array or possibly through the get array.